In the vast, sun-scorched plains of the Sahel, something unexpected stirred beneath the silence. A small, landlocked nation, Burkina Faso, did something no one thought possible. Under the quiet authority of President Ibrahim Traoré, the country placed a ban on all imports of American soybeans. There was no fanfare, no fiery declaration, no headlines announcing rebellion. Yet within hours, a ripple of shock ran through trading floors from Washington to Wall Street. What seemed like an obscure bureaucratic decision became the opening move in what analysts would soon call a $100 billion food war. For decades, American agribusiness had treated African markets like convenient outlets for surplus production. Heavily subsidized, genetically modified soybeans, shipped across the Atlantic, priced so low that local farmers simply could not compete. Village by village, small producers gave up, fields lay fallow, and a generation of growers turned to import-based survival. Burkina Faso, like so many others, accepted this imbalance as inevitable. One man decided it no longer would. Traoré's decision was not born from anger or ideology. It was born from calculation. Behind the one-page memo that halted soybean imports was more than a year of silent groundwork. As early as 2024, intelligence briefings reaching the presidential palace had warned that over a third of Burkina Faso's soybean products came from the United States, filtered through brokers in Togo and Ghana, disguised behind third-party contracts. The numbers told a grim story. Every container of cheap foreign soy pushed local farmers closer to extinction. And so, a plan was conceived, one that would change the very roots of the nation's economy. It began with a code name, Project Khalifa, drawn from an old Mossi word meaning to restore the root. Traoré instructed his ministers to rebuild the nation's agricultural base from the soil upward. Government warehouses quietly began stockpiling heirloom soybean seeds. Agreements were signed with research stations in Mali and India to help diversify and strengthen local varieties. Solar-powered oil extraction units were delivered to remote villages, operated by newly trained youth brigades. By the time the embargo was signed, more than 100,000 families had received equipment, credit, and guaranteed buyers for their harvests. It was not a protest, it was an exit strategy. The outside world barely noticed. Western analysts dismissed the measure as symbolic, a small nation's attempt to posture against the inevitable tide of global trade. But inside Burkina Faso, something was shifting. Within days of the decree, ships carrying American soy were left waiting at West African ports. Customs officials in Lome and Tema began citing procedural reviews and temporary inspections. The delays weren't bureaucratic, they were contagious. Within weeks, neighboring Mali, Niger, and Guinea began tightening checks on soybean imports of their own. No one called it coordination, but everyone understood it was the beginning of a regional awakening. Across social media, videos appeared of farmers pressing golden oil from locally grown soybeans. In the markets of Ouagadougou, bottles labeled Burkina Pure replaced imported brands. Radio hosts debated food independence with a passion usually reserved for politics. University students formed cooperatives to support small producers. The embargo, once seen as an act of defiance, was transforming into a national cause, a quiet revolution, centered not on ideology, but on survival. Through it all, Traoré remained silent. There were no speeches, no public boasts, no rallying cries. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, expanding domestic infrastructure. The Ministry of Agriculture provided new formulas for livestock feed, made from native legumes. Engineers rebuilt key rural roads to connect villages to markets. Old military storage containers were converted into grain silos. For the first time in years, the system was feeding itself. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was swift. Soybean futures slipped. The U.S. Soy Export Council called Burkina Faso's move a declaration of economic warfare. Think tanks urged the State Department to act before other African states followed. But Washington's leverage was limited. Burkina Faso had withdrawn from most major Western lending programs years earlier. There were no IMF loans to suspend, no trade treaties to weaponize. The country had quietly built the one thing most African economies lacked room to maneuver. By mid-2025, while international markets buzzed with speculation, Traoré was already moving to the next phase. He convened a closed-door summit in Ouagadougou with officials from Mali, Guinea, and Niger, all members of the Alliance of Sahel States. Their focus was not politics but logistics, how to integrate their agricultural systems so none would ever again depend on imports. What emerged was the blueprint for the AES AgriCorps initiative, a plan to link grain reserves, processing plants, and transport corridors across borders. Trucks, silos, and shared storage, not speeches, would form the backbone of this new sovereignty. Days later, the first trilateral agreement was signed. Border tariffs for soy-based products were eliminated between the three countries. Joint purchasing programs began. Engineers surveyed potential sites for cross-border processing hubs. And beneath the surface of official statements, another innovation took shape: a digital grain credit system called Agri. Backed by national grain reserves, it allowed cooperatives and schools to trade in tokens redeemable for food and services. Within weeks, 40 cooperatives had adopted it. Rural hospitals began accepting grain credits for energy payments. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and it was theirs. Outside observers scoffed. Economists called it naive, a token gesture from an impoverished region. But inside the Sahel, the mood was different. For once, the region was not reacting to a crisis, it was building something new. Reports began circulating through African policy forums describing a Burkina model. Even countries as far away as Tanzania and Ethiopia sent delegations to observe how a nation long dismissed as dependent had learned to stand on its own. By the summer of 2025, the tone in Western capitals had shifted from amusement to alarm. What had begun as a bureaucratic order in a forgotten customs office now threatened to redraw trade routes worth billions. In July, Traoré addressed the National Assembly with data, not rhetoric, charts showing export growth, increases in rural income, and a steady drop in foreign dependency. Then, in a single line that would echo across Francophone Africa, he said, "We are not withdrawing from the world, we are returning to ourselves." The applause was not loud, but lasting. From that moment, Burkina Faso's trajectory changed irreversibly. The embargo had grown beyond soybeans. It had become a symbol of defiance, a test case for whether Africa could chart its own economic path without permission. Western analysts still framed it as a short-term disruption, but in the villages, the shift felt permanent. Farmers planted with renewed purpose. Markets adjusted to local products, and slowly, the idea of dependency, the quiet belief that survival required foreign imports, began to die. By the time autumn arrived, the question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could survive without U.S. soy. It was whether the world could survive a Burkina Faso that no longer needed it. By the start of autumn 2025, the winds across the Sahel carried more than dust. They carried a question whispered in trading halls, in university corridors, and in Washington boardrooms. What exactly was Ibrahim Traoré building? What began as a trade embargo had evolved into something deeper, a slow, deliberate rewriting of the rules that defined who fed whom. In the capital Ouagadougou, government warehouses hummed with new rhythm. Grain storage silos, once relics of foreign aid projects, now filled with locally grown soy. On village radios, farmers called in to share harvest updates, like breaking news. The embargo had not caused famine, as many predicted. It had done the opposite. It forced the country to look inward, to rebuild what had been quietly eroded by decades of dependence. But Traoré wasn't celebrating. He knew a single season's success could vanish with one drought or market shock. So he moved again, carefully, almost invisibly. In September, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea announced a joint venture, a regional grain stabilization mechanism called AFROP. Each nation would contribute a portion of its strategic reserves to a shared pool, stored in decentralized silos across their borders. It wasn't a political stunt. It was insurance, a promise that no member state would ever again go hungry because a foreign market decided to close its gates. This was a quiet revolution disguised as logistics. No speeches, no slogans, just trucks, silos, and spreadsheets. For the first time, Africa was not being assisted with food security, it was creating its own. Western analysts were skeptical. Reports from Brussels called the plan unsustainable. Financial institutions warned of structural inefficiencies, but inside Burkina Faso, confidence grew. Rural families who had once waited for international relief now watched their own crops fill government reserves. The narrative was changing, and the people could feel it. On a humid October morning, Traoré visited a new soy processing facility in Bobodu. He didn't arrive with cameras or bodyguards. He came quietly, walking among farmers and technicians. A young woman, barely 20, handed him a jar of locally refined soybean oil, the first batch produced without a single imported grain. Traoré smiled and said only, "This is sovereignty you can taste." His approach was calm but strategic. While others debated ideology, he built systems. He expanded AgriCredit, integrating it with schools, hospitals, and cooperatives. Within months, rural teachers were being paid partly in grain-backed tokens, which they could redeem for food or energy. What once sounded like utopia was becoming a functioning economy, small, simple, but real. Yet not everyone was convinced. In urban circles, business elites worried. Some accused Traoré of isolating Burkina Faso, of jeopardizing access to foreign capital. But the president didn't silence them, he invited them. In mid-October, he held a public audit of the AgriCredit system, televised nationwide. Economists, journalists, and even opposition figures were allowed to review the books. The results stunned many: transparent, efficient, and growing. Critics didn't disappear, but they were forced to acknowledge one thing: the system worked. Meanwhile, outside Africa, patience was wearing thin. U.S. trade envoys began applying quiet pressure on neighboring states, offering cooperation, packages, and revised export deals to slow the spread of the Burkina model. But by then, it was too late. The idea had already taken root. In Tanzania, policymakers cited Burkina Faso as a proof of concept for food sovereignty. In Ethiopia, agricultural institutes began studying the impact of grain credit systems. Even in South America, farmers' unions in Brazil discussed Traoré's policies as inspiration for resisting corporate monopolies. For the global north, this wasn't just about soybeans anymore, it was about control. If one African nation could unhook itself from dependency, others might follow. Billions in agricultural exports, loans, and development programs suddenly seemed vulnerable. The food war had entered its next phase, one fought not with tariffs or sanctions, but with narratives. Western media began to paint Traoré as a populist, a rogue, even a destabilizing force. But within Burkina Faso, he was seen differently, as a builder, not a fighter. By November, Burkina Faso's grain reserves hit record levels. School meal programs were now fully supplied by domestic crops. Farmers, once invisible in the national economy, were suddenly central to it. For the first time in living memory, the nation's prosperity was tied, not to exports or foreign donors, but to its own soil. One evening, under a neem tree in the rural heartland, Traoré met with farmers for what would be one of his most memorable addresses. There were no cameras, no grand stage, just the earth beneath their feet and the scent of harvest in the air. He said softly, "The world will forget headlines, but the land remembers what we plant." That line spread across the country like wildfire. It appeared on murals, school walls, and market banners. It became a mantra, a reminder that sovereignty wasn't declared, it was cultivated. By year's end, Burkina Faso had transformed from a quiet participant in the global food chain into its loudest question mark. A nation that once imported dependence was now exporting an idea that dignity could grow from the ground up. And as the world's attention turned toward this once overlooked country, one truth became undeniable. Ibrahim Traoré had indeed declared a war. He had simply chosen not to lose one. The fields of Burkina Faso stood as living proof that the future of Africa might not be decided in foreign boardrooms or on trading screens, but in the hands of those who plant, harvest, and believe.